In 1946, the NAACP picketed movie theaters across America to stop children from seeing a Disney film. That movie was Song of the South. And civil rights leaders knew something that most parents didn't. Disney wasn't just making cartoons anymore. They were manufacturing white supremacy for kids, wrapped in catchy songs and cute characters. What they discovered would expose how America's most trusted family brand spent decades programming children to see whiteness as magic and blackness as comedy, servants, or nothing at all. Everything you think you know about Disney's innocent past is a lie. From 1928 through the 1960s, Walt Disney Studio didn't just reflect American racism, they perfected it, packaged it, and sold it to every family in America. While other studios made films for adults who already had their racial views formed, Disney specialized in catching children early, using animation and theme parks to embed white supremacist ideology so deep that generations of kids would never even notice it was there. The FBI knew Disney was reliable enough to use as an informant during the Red Scare. Civil rights organizations knew Disney was dangerous enough to organize national boycotts. But somehow, your history teachers never mentioned any of this. Here's what the Mouse House spent 70 years trying to hide. They didn't stumble into racist content by accident. They built their empire on a deliberate system of racial hierarchy that made white characters the heroes of every story, while reducing black people to minstrel show punchlines, grateful servants, or invisible ghosts haunting the edges of American history. And when civil rights leaders tried to stop them, Disney didn't just ignore the criticism, they doubled down, creating theme parks that turned white nostalgia into a literal magic kingdom, while erasing black contributions to the same history they were selling as patriotic education. But how did a cartoon mouse become one of the most powerful propaganda tools in American history? How did Disney convince millions of families that their racial fantasies were just wholesome entertainment? And why are they only now admitting what civil rights leaders tried to tell America over 70 years ago? Mickey Mouse made his debut in 1928, but Disney's racial programming started immediately. Those early cartoons weren't just experimenting with animation techniques, they were beta testing racial humor that came straight from minstrel shows. Characters' faces would turn black from explosions, presented as comedy. Mickey and friends performed Uncle Tom's Cabin in blackface in a 1933 cartoon called Mickey's Melodrama. While other studios hid their racist content in live-action films aimed at adults, Disney was delivering the same minstrel show stereotypes directly to children, disguised as harmless animal antics and slapstick comedy. This wasn't accidental borrowing from American culture. Walt Disney and his animators were deliberately drawing from vaudeville and minstrel traditions, but they were doing something more insidious than their predecessors. They were training children to see racial mockery as normal entertainment. When kids laughed at Mickey in blackface, they weren't just enjoying a cartoon. They were learning that black identity was a costume white characters could put on for laughs, something ridiculous and temporary that existed for their amusement. If you believe these hidden stories about how Disney shaped American racial attitudes deserve to be told, subscribe to Black Stories Untold and help us expose the truth they've been hiding for decades. These aren't just old cartoons we're talking about. This is about how one company programmed generations of children to see race the way white supremacists wanted them to. Now, back to the video. By 1940, Disney had perfected their formula with Fantasia, a film they promoted as high art for sophisticated audiences. The original theatrical version included a black centaur character named Sunflower in the Pastoral Symphony sequence, designed with every racist stereotype you can imagine, and relegated to serving white centaurs like a plantation servant. When civil rights pressure mounted years later, Disney didn't apologize. They just quietly removed Sunflower from all future releases, pretending she never existed. That's how confident they were in their system. They could make black characters disappear from their own films, and most audiences would never even notice. But Sunflower was just practice for what came next. In 1941, Disney released Dumbo, featuring a group of crows who spoke in minstrel show dialects and taught a white elephant how to fly. The crow characters weren't just stereotypical. They were a masterclass in how to make racist caricature seem helpful and friendly. Kids watching Dumbo learned that black characters existed to serve white protagonists. that their value came from entertaining white people with their colorful dialect and musical abilities, and that they should be grateful just to be included in the story at all. The lead crow wasn't officially named Jim Crow, but Disney knew exactly what they were referencing, and so did every adult who understood the connection to Jim Crow segregation laws. During World War II, Disney's propaganda partnership with the US government revealed just how powerful their influence had become. The studio that had spent over a decade training children to see racial hierarchy as natural entertainment was now officially working with federal agencies to shape American attitudes about enemies and allies. Disney produced military training films filled with racial caricatures of Japanese people, using the same animation techniques they'd perfected for domestic racial stereotypes. The government trusted Disney to program soldiers' racial attitudes because they'd already proven they could program children's. But Disney's masterpiece of racial manipulation was still coming. In 1946, they released Song of the South, combining live action and animation to tell stories about a cheerful black man entertaining white children on a plantation. The film never explicitly stated whether slavery had ended, creating a deliberate ambiguity that let audiences imagine a world where black people were content in their subordinate roles, grateful for the opportunity to serve white families, and naturally gifted at providing comfort and entertainment without expecting equality in return. Civil rights leaders saw exactly what Disney was doing. The NAACP organized protests before the film even hit theaters, picketing premieres and writing directly to Walt Disney, demanding he cancel the release. Walter White, the NAACP's executive secretary, warned that Song of the South would undo decades of progress in challenging stereotypes about black people, essentially providing a Disney-branded argument that plantation life wasn't so bad, and black people were happiest when they knew their place. Disney released Song of the South anyway. The film was commercially successful, won an Academy Award for Best Song with Zippity Doo-Dah, and gave James Baskett an honorary Oscar for his performance as Uncle Remus. But here's the detail that reveals everything about American racial attitudes in 1946. Baskett couldn't attend the film's Atlanta premiere because of segregation laws. Disney created a movie celebrating black servitude, gave the black star an award for his performance, but couldn't guarantee him a seat at his own movie's opening night. The company was perfectly comfortable profiting from black performance while accepting that black humanity was negotiable depending on local white preferences. What happened next proves that Disney knew exactly how problematic their racial content was. As civil rights movements gained power through the 1950s and 1960s, Disney didn't defend Song of the South or argue for its historical value. Instead, they locked it in the vault, never releasing it on home video in the United States, while quietly continuing to profit from its characters and songs. This wasn't a company learning from past mistakes. This was a company managing their brand image while preserving their right to exploit racial content when convenient. Meanwhile, Disney was building something even more powerful than films: theme parks that would literally construct white American identity as a physical space children could walk through and experience. When Disneyland opened in 1955, Main Street USA presented an idealized version of small-town America circa 1900 to 1910, complete with barbershop quartets, horse-drawn carriages, and turn-of-the-century charm. What it didn't include were any black people, despite the fact that black Americans were very much part of small-town American life in 1900. Disney had created a magical place where white nostalgia could exist without the complications of actual American history. Frontierland told the story of westward expansion as a noble adventure, minimizing indigenous perspectives and presenting white settlement as natural progress. Liberty Square and later attractions like the Hall of Presidents taught children about American history through narratives that centered white founding fathers and white achievements, while reducing black contributions to a brief mention of emancipation. Disney wasn't just entertaining families, they were providing historical education that taught children which Americans mattered and which ones existed only as footnotes to white achievement. This is where Disney's influence became truly insidious. Movies could be dismissed as entertainment, but theme parks felt like education. When families spent thousands of dollars to visit Disney World, they weren't just buying rides. They were buying into a version of American identity that felt authoritative because it was expensive, elaborate, and endorsed by millions of other families making the same pilgrimage. Children who grew up visiting Disney parks learned that real American history looked like Main Street, USA, sounded like the Hall of Presidents, and centered the experiences of people who looked like the majority of Disney's characters. The genius of Disney's system was that it made white supremacy feel wholesome. Kids didn't learn to hate black people. They learned not to think about black people at all, except as background characters, service providers, or historical victims who had been rescued by white heroes and white institutions. Disney taught children that white experiences were universal, white stories were timeless, and white perspectives were objective truth rather than particular viewpoints shaped by racial advantage. In 1956, Disney hired Floyd Norman as their first black animator, but his experience reveals how the company maintained its racial hierarchy even when integrating its workforce. Norman worked on classics like Sleeping Beauty and The Jungle Book, but he often found himself the only black person in creative meetings, surrounded by colleagues who had spent their careers drawing the racial stereotypes that civil rights organizations had been protesting for decades. Norman later described feeling both welcomed by some colleagues and isolated by the company's overwhelming whiteness, knowing that his presence was historic, but also recognizing how much work remained to change Disney's fundamental approach to racial representation. By the 1990s, Disney was facing renewed criticism, but their response revealed how little their basic approach had changed. The 1992 film Aladdin featured lyrics about Arab lands, where they cut off your ear if they don't like your face. It's barbaric, but hey, it's home. Arab American groups protested the stereotypical imagery, and Disney eventually changed the lyrics for home video releases. But the pattern was familiar. Create stereotypical content, face organized opposition, make minimal changes while maintaining the profitable core product. When Disney finally created their first black princess in 2009 with The Princess and the Frog, the film generated as much controversy as praise. Critics pointed out that Tiana spent most of the movie transformed into a frog, that the story emphasized hard work themes that echoed respectability politics, and that the villain used voodoo imagery that reinforced stereotypes about black spiritual practices. Even Disney's attempts at positive representation revealed how decades of racial programming had shaped their storytelling instincts. But the most revealing moment in Disney's racial reckoning came in 2020, when nationwide protests following George Floyd's murder forced American institutions to confront their roles in perpetuating white supremacy. Disney's response was telling. They announced that Splash Mountain, the theme park attraction based on Song of the South characters, would be rethemed to The Princess and the Frog. They also added content warnings to older films on Disney+, acknowledging that content included negative depictions and/or mistreatment of people or cultures. These changes came 74 years after the NAACP first protested Song of the South. Disney didn't proactively address their racial content. They responded to public pressure, market forces, and social media campaigns that made their historical practices too expensive to maintain. The company that had spent decades teaching children to see whiteness as universal and blackness as marginal was now admitting that civil rights leaders had been right all along, but only after generations of children had already internalized the lessons Disney had been teaching. Here's what makes Disney's racial programming so dangerous. It worked exactly as intended. Multiple generations of American children grew up seeing Disney films, visiting Disney parks, and absorbing Disney's version of American identity without recognizing it as racial propaganda. They learned to see white characters as relatable heroes, white history as universal truth, and white perspectives as objective reality. They learned that black characters existed to serve white stories, that black history began with white salvation, and that black voices mattered only when they entertained white audiences or confirmed white narratives. The impact extends far beyond entertainment. Disney's cultural influence shaped how children understood citizenship, belonging, and national identity. Kids who grew up with Disney's version of American history were more likely to see contemporary racial inequalities as natural rather than constructed. more likely to view civil rights movements as complaints rather than corrections, and more likely to believe that white perspectives represented common sense rather than particular interests shaped by centuries of racial advantage. Disney's power came from their ability to make their racial ideology feel like childhood innocence rather than political programming. Parents who would never explicitly teach their children white supremacist beliefs happily paid Disney to do it through characters, songs, and magical experiences that felt wholesome and traditional. The company understood that racial attitudes formed in childhood were more durable than political arguments made to adults, and they spent decades perfecting techniques for embedding racial hierarchy in content that felt like pure entertainment. Today's Disney acknowledges some past problems while maintaining the profitable elements of their racial system. They've added content warnings to old films while continuing to profit from songs like Zippity Doo-Dah. They've rethemed Splash Mountain while keeping most of their park attractions focused on white historical narratives. They've created diverse characters while maintaining storytelling formulas that center white experiences and perspectives. But the deeper issue isn't Disney's past. It's how their racial programming shaped American culture in ways we're still discovering. Generations of children learned from Disney that white stories were universal, white characters were relatable, and white perspectives were objective truth. They learned that blackness was something to be entertained by, inspired by, or grateful for, but not something to center, trust, or follow. They learned that American history was fundamentally a white story, with black people playing supporting roles as problems to be solved or servants to be appreciated. The FBI files that revealed Walt Disney's cooperation with government surveillance programs during the Red Scare show how thoroughly Disney understood their cultural power and how willingly they used it to support white political interests. The company that taught children to see racial hierarchy as natural entertainment was also reporting suspected communists to federal agents, connecting their racial programming to broader efforts to suppress challenges to American power structures. This is why civil rights organizations have been fighting Disney for over 70 years, and why that fight continues today. Disney isn't just an entertainment company. They're one of the most powerful storytelling institutions on Earth, with influence over how children understand identity, history, and belonging. When Disney tells stories that center whiteness and marginalize blackness, they're not just reflecting American culture, they're actively creating it, shaping how millions of children will understand race for the rest of their lives. The content warnings Disney added to older films represent an admission that their programming worked exactly as civil rights leaders warned it would. Disney spent decades teaching children that racial stereotypes were harmless entertainment, that white perspectives were universal truth, and that black voices mattered only when they served white stories. Now they're quietly acknowledging that this content was harmful while continuing to profit from the cultural systems they helped create. But here's what Disney still won't admit. Their racial programming wasn't a mistake or a reflection of different times. It was a deliberate business strategy that used childhood innocence to make white supremacy feel magical. They understood that children who learned to see whiteness as heroic and blackness as secondary would carry those beliefs into adulthood, creating generations of Americans who would defend racial inequality without recognizing it as racism, because Disney had taught them to see it as natural, traditional, and wholesome. The mouse that started as a simple cartoon character became the mascot for one of the most successful racial programming operations in American history. Disney didn't just entertain children, they educated them about who mattered, who belonged, and who deserved to be centered in American stories. And they did it so skillfully that most people still don't recognize Disney's racial content as political programming rather than innocent entertainment. This systematic manipulation of childhood innocence to advance white supremacist ideology represents one of the most sophisticated and successful propaganda operations in modern American history. And the most disturbing part? It's still working. Generations of Americans continue to defend Disney's racial content as harmless nostalgia, while unconsciously carrying forward the racial attitudes Disney spent decades embedding in their developing minds. If this story about Disney's hidden role in shaping American racial attitudes opened your eyes, click on that video right there to uncover more suppressed Black history that will blow your mind. about how our culture was deliberately constructed to center whiteness and erase Black excellence.